is new, and how can we know when?
How can we know when it arises? Okay, so yesterday I was talking with my husband, and he told me this story. It happened the other day on one of these cheap flights in the U.S., JetBlue or something. Did you hear about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The flight attendant who quit?
Wait, I haven't.
Everybody's heard the story.
No, I just scanned it. I just scanned it.
Huh?
I mean, I just scanned the story, and I'm like, that's the, I'm expressing myself.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, well, let me tell the story in my way, because I want it to lead to the powers of the false. So, there's this, and you can correct me, that's actually read the story. There's an altercation before the flight takes off between a passenger, a female passenger, and a flight attendant, male, for what that matters. And she's arguing about trying to get her luggage into the overhead rack and abusing him. And she pulls the overhead rack down and hits him on the head, cuts him. And then toward the end of the flight, when the plane is taxiing, she gets up and starts messing around again in her bag, and he has to go, the flight attendant has to go and tell the passenger to sit down, and she abuses him again, must be in some really terrible way. And so, let's go to stop at this point. The flight attendant gets on the intercom and says, I would like to thank all the people who have been kind to me in the last 20 years. Then he gets a beer, opens the emergency door, inflating the slide, and slides out. That is the news. That is, now you recall, and I'll just quote you something from the section on the powers of the false that you all probably read. Becoming is the power of the false of life. So, you recall the sensory motor schema that you were talking about a few days ago.
Professor Mark, so becoming
is the power of the false of life. So we're going to talk about the power of the false a little bit now. But what that flight attendant did was an act of pure becoming. So think of the sensory motor schema that we talked about before. You have the perception image, the action image, and the relation image. In between them, the affection. So the perception, affection, action, and relation. Usually occurring in sequence. Shall we write that again? Or you remember pretty well? And so the links between these things, from perception to affection, from affection to action, from action to relation or to thought, these tend to be pretty fixed, especially in matters of routine, of habit, of the right thing to do. As Deleuze writes elsewhere in this section of the chapter, narration always refers to a system of judgment. So if you think that in terms of this episode on JetBlue, what would, in a sensory motor schema, in a normal pattern of events, what would have happened, or what should have happened? What should the flight attendant have done?
He should have kept his cool.
And why?
Because that would have been professional.
Yeah, he would have kept his job.
Yeah, that's what's expected.
Yes. But when one of those links from perception to action, for example, breaks down, or when affection, when that moment of affection is so powerful that it breaks the usual linkage from perception to action, the sensory motor schema breaks down, the normal causal relationships break down, and Deleuze calls what results a purely optical and sound situation. That is, you perceive events not as they're supposed to be, but as they truly are. And this, he writes, makes us grasp something unbearable. That's what happened to the flight attendant. He grasped something unbearable. In that moment of affection, he was bleeding, he was abused, he should have carried on and done, kept on doing his job and being professional and dealt with this horrible, abusive person. But he took a line of flight. He saw the situation as what it was, and he did something new. It was a beautiful thing,
So I'm trying to see if there is a notion of choice at all. Because, it's what he did is there for us to see. It's almost extravagant, so it's easy to say in a sense, hey, that's new. But what if somebody had done, and I don't know if there's room for choice in what you're talking about, but if there is, they could have responded in a different way that would still have been creative, potentially, and they, with different results. Maybe they would have kept their job, or maybe they would have faced the person, for example, face the person that is doing all this misery to him.
Send your luggage out in the emergency exit down there.
Yeah, well, there's that too, right? For example.
Let's solve this.
Yeah, he could have done the just thing. The just thing, the Christian thing would have been, to graciously, intelligently, put the passenger in her place, retain his dignity, retain his job. And that, I would say, would keep the flight attendant locked in the routine of the sensory motor schema, which, especially when it's translated into the kind of the everyday drudgery of doing our jobs and living up to our expectations, it's a killing thing. So he departed from that and departed from that organic regime, as we'll talk about in just a moment. James?
So is it that he broke out of his everyday drudgery? Is that what made it new?
He broke out in a way that sprang from affect, that contact with the virtual that affect consists of, and he allowed that affective intervention to spur him to do something new. And this is why I wouldn't call it a choice. I don't think maybe he did, but I don't think he sort of thought and okay, here are my 5 or 6 options, which should I do? I think he spontaneously sprang out with this action.
Well, and I just keep getting flashes. I hate to bring office space. Is, when you're in your job, you fantasize about what I'd like to do and you don't do it. And in the office space, every single trope of what you'd like to do, you'd like to come to work in shorts with raw fish and dump them on your desk and start gutting them. I'm here, but I'm going to knock down the wall that keeps you from the window. So somebody who actually starts to act out all these things that we imagine about how to make our sufferable jobs.
Yeah, in part, these interventions that break down what Deleuze calls the sensory motor system are, simply acts of rebellion. But I think even rebellion is somehow enslaved to the system.
Right, which it seems to me that just because he left the plane, that doesn't make it an act of becoming. Because becoming is when you go from something majoritarian to something minoritarian. So
he lost his job.
Yeah, no, but just because you revolt doesn't mean you like create the new. Like what I would see as becoming in that instance would it be if he sat down like in a seat and like took on the role of the passenger of the plane.
I think it's a good idea to push the button and have this slide.
Yeah,
Everyone in the
it's
plane
partly
wants
Right, but
to do
that's-
that one.
that's-
It's partly just like this giant yellow thing erupting
Whee!
in the space. I mean, that that alone releases more affect.
Right, no,
But in the space, I mean, the flight was here.
The
No.
plane had landed.
Yeah.
The plane had landed.
Okay,
People
okay.
would have died if they did.
Yeah.
It
Would have
wasn't
been
a
like snakes on a
suicide.
plane.
I think what Ryan, I think both could be sort of examples of the new, just insofar as the action was sort of a singular action. It wasn't
Yes.
some kind of comment, we would see the flight, normally anyone would have acted this way. This is what we were expecting. What Ryan said was unexpected as well as
Yeah,
jumping out of the
that's
slide.
true.
So
That
there's
would have
kind of
also.
two different configurations of sort of a new, and yours was kind of comedic.
Mm-hmm.
But-
just revolting, like just rebelling, doesn't
But that's what I'm
create
saying.
the
I don't think
conditions
this is
for
not
them.
just. That's exactly what I just said. So I agree with you. It's not just. It's rebelling against a situation actually confirms that situation. It's making a break. And yes, as Bree says, creating singularity. And of course, there, by definition, there's not only one line of flight. The two things that we mentioned are both. But getting back to your mention of choice, Lionel, I think when possible options are stated as choices, they remain part of the sensory motor system. You know how a parent says to a child, "You have a choice. You can eat your carrots before your applesauce, or your applesauce before your carrots." And they're trying to instill in the child the idea that it has some sort of agency. I see this as something. I see this as something kind of killing, kind of limiting.
Well, there's no creativity here.
Because, all the possibilities of, all possible choices are already delimited, they're already finite, so there's no new. But Deleuze has a notion of freedom, there's definitely necessity, but we have this sort of paradox of a freedom, a contingent necessity.
Right.
So there's freedom, but it's not necessarily actually choice of this or this, because there's no choice there, because the choice is already determined. The two options, there's already a finite set of possibilities, there's really no new in the choice.
Well, Jean-Paul Sartre would say something like, you have the choice to either conform or to choose as in create.
Yeah, this is a different body. This is a
I
different
understand.
body
I
of thought.
But
I think I'm not an expert on Sartre, but I would say that existentialism makes so much dependent on consciousness and the will, whereas the powers of the false spring from something that is pre-cognitive and
It is the power. I think the there is a power to create in the new. There's this really good article by Daniel Smith called "The Conditions of the New" that you should read if you want to talk about the new in terms of creation.
yeah.
well, I assume that most of you read the excerpt from the Powers of the False chapter. So let us talk about that a little bit.
Can I just get one more clarification? Sorry, I try not to do this. I'm not a philosopher with a philosophy background. This really seems like a really simple concept, and I don't understand why I don't understand it. So, is the becoming? Is it the act of okay? So he reacts in a sort of an affective way. He probably didn't think. Maybe he had thought about, one day I'm going to push that thing, I'm going to crack open a beer, and I'm going to slide down, and finally and he was like, oh, that's crazy, and finally he did it. Or maybe it was in the moment, he just started acting, right? And just, and afterwards he went, wow, that was a way to go out. Whatever, however it happened, that in itself is becoming, because it's a break from the majority. And so does that act as itself stand alone? I mean, what if he gets his job back, starts to be a flight attendant somewhere else, goes on Letterman, The Today Show, like all these, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Which I'm sure that he'll do,
Mm-hmm.
which is totally mainstream majority.
Yeah,
So it's
that-
hard
that
for me
will-
to, I don't understand the concept.
I mean, a break need not always lead to, it may be only a momentary break.
Okay.
Most of the breaks with the sensory motor system are momentary because it's so, it's so totalitarian. So all the more reason to cherish these little flashes when they occur. But yeah, so he might not have, he might not get any further than Letterman, and he'll end up being even more kind of defined than before. But let's go through these few pages a little bit, and I think it will shed some light. Now, actually, I brought that PDF, and we could project it and look at it if we wanted to. Okay. So, in this section about the powers of the false, Deleuze is describing the difference between what he calls the organic regime, which is the regime of the sensory motor schema that you all know very well, and the crystalline regime. Now, the organic regime depends on a situation and characters reacting to a situation in terms of its truthfulness. In the crystalline regime, the usual sensory motor links are broken, and an event can detach from its expected motor linkages, such as a flight attendant, holding his temper, and connect to virtualities. And like a seed crystal, this virtuality that becomes disturbed can connect with more and more virtual events. So now what happened on the plane is not really a crystal image. There was one single line of flight. But in the crystalline regime, it starts to become impossible to distinguish between actual and virtual. And Deleuze writes that because he's writing about cinema, he goes into a discussion of the forger, movies about forgeries. And he says the forger is the maker of crystal images, because rather than images that rely on the usual relations of truthfulness, the forger is creating an image that is going to create a series of falsities, of departures.
Right.
Yes. So, what he calls the power of the false calls upon that field of virtualities accompanying every actualization that we've mentioned a couple of times, where when one event is actual, there's a simultaneity of a number of virtual events. But the way he talks about it, using Leibniz, is a simultaneity of incompossible presence, or the coexistence of not necessarily true pasts. And what a simultaneity of incompossible presence, or the coexistence of not necessarily true pasts. And what he's doing here is using Leibniz's concept of the incompossible, which is actually not it's a good concept. Incompossibility is a relationship among possible worlds. Possible worlds that cannot be the same world because they contain contradictory events. Leibniz's example is the world in which Adam sinned, which is the world that we are in, and another world in which Adam did not sin. Now, for Leibniz, because the monad contains the entire world, we call them the monad can see the whole world from its perspective, and therefore in some way contains the whole world. So we can't have, our world cannot be the world in which Adam did not sin. But since it's possible that Adam did not sin, there must be a world where Adam did not sin, right? So that's another world. There's a world where James did not buy a Coke today, etc. So we get this infinity of possible worlds. Now the reason Leibniz does this is to ensure God's freedom. That's not really so important to us. So once you have this notion of an infinity of possible worlds, the idea of what is virtual expands to infinity. And with this resulting great scope of virtual connections with actual events.
Maybe bottom of page 141 there is a nice quote about the power of false. It might be helpful to read it together and unpack what you think.
Mm-hmm. That's just what I wanted to do. Would you read it to us?
Okay. Of course there is no more truth in one life than in the other. There is only becoming, and becoming is the power of the false, of the life, the will to power. But there is good and bad, that is, noble and base. According to physicists, noble energy is the kind which is capable of transforming itself, while the base kind can no longer do so. Should I continue? Or?
Yes, please.
Yeah. There is will to power on both sides, but the latter is nothing more than the will to dominate in the exhausted coming of life, while the former is artistic will or virtue which gives the creation of new possibilities in the outpouring becoming. The so-called higher men are base or bad, but the good has only one name. It is generosity, and this is the trait by which, do you say Wells?
Yes.
Defines his favorite character, Falstaff.
Because this whole section is about Orson Welles.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It is also the trait which we suppose is dominant in Don Quixote, that's how I would say it.
Mm-hmm.
Eternal project. If becoming is the power of the false, then the good, the generous, the noble is what raises the false to the nth power of the will to power to the level of artistic becoming. Falstaff and Don Quixote may appear to be braggarts or to be pitiful. History having passed them by, they are experts in metamorphosis of life. They oppose becoming to history. Incommensurable to any judgment, they have the innocence of becoming. Should I continue? Because that's already quite a lot to it.
It is already quite a lot. Let's look back and okay.
No, I don't understand how we went straight from the paradox of contingent futures.
Yeah.
to this quote.
It is,
That's a hard paradox.
Okay, it is a bit of a jump, but we'll get back to that.
Okay, so we'll be here now.
We'll go back. Actually, it does make a little more sense to do it in sequence. Than what you just read is very good. So how about if we slowly move toward it?
Sure, where do you want to go?
I want to go to okay. So we have this concept of see my notes. We have this concept of multiple worlds to what Lionel just read. Right. So Deleuze, using this concept of an infinite number of possible worlds, he removes the condition of God's freedom that Leibniz uses. Instead, he sides with Nietzsche and says, in fact, this all occurs in the same world. This world includes Adam not sinning, James buying Pepsi today, and all these other things. In fact, quantum physicists call this a Hilbert space. All of the infinite number of possible iterations of the world. So, now that we have this concept of an enormous number of virtualities accompanying and mirroring, but in a different way, every actual event, we can get to this concept of the power of the false. On 131, he mentions that the falsifying detail is a singularity that indicates the same monad in another possible world. So, to continue with this rather frivolous example, James with the Pepsi, today here in our class, would be the singularity that indicates that this is another possible world. Or Adam, having all of Adam's same qualities, but not sinning, would be his qualities would be the singularities that distinguish him as a singular. Okay. So, getting to the question of judgment. So the sensory motor schema is requiring us constantly to make judgments. What should the flight attendant do? What should the normal relationships of cause and effect be? These judgments prevent us from really seeing the situation in itself. I still hold that flight attendant had a moment of absolute clarity where he saw the situation for what it was, and this powered him to make a break with the sensory motor schema. And just to bring in a little bit of Islamic thought to this, there was a Sufi mystic, a woman who died in the year 801, Rabia al-Adawiyya, who lived in Basra, and she was famous for walking through town with a torch in one hand and a bucket of water. And people would say, Rabia, why are you doing that? And she would say, I want to burn down the clouds of heaven and put out the fires of hell. So the people will stop acting according to wanting to be saved and go to heaven and wanting to avoid hell. And so that they should instead focus on the presence of God in this world. So in a way, Rabia was also trying to break the sensory motor schema where people do things out of fear or out of hope for a future state that makes them follow cliche actions.
See, that makes more sense to me than the flight attendant, because the flight
It's a
attendant.
more profound example.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the flight attendant just seems like reactive rather than a moment of clarity. I mean, you don't, unless he's like ready to retire or something. I mean, throwing away your job because one person is rude doesn't seem like a moment of clarity to me.
The kind of clarity that Deleuze writes about quite often, where people realize that they are enslaved in their normal walks of life, in their jobs, working in factories, carrying out routine activities. Deleuze is quite clear that most of the way people live is death-like and enslaving. So I think Deleuze would think that the flight attendant, like it's not clarity as in, a rational comprehension of a situation. It's like it's a piercing view of things as they really are. So lightning suddenly struck, and so he saw like the usual relations fell away. This is my job. It's not so good, but I make a decent salary and I get to fly places. That woman's a jerk, but whatever. I'll deal with it. That certain kind of enslavement involved in maintaining those beliefs. Okay. All right. So I was saying the sensory motor schema is requiring us constantly to make judgments. Judgment confirms what already exists. This, I think, is kind of the problem with the flight attendant, making a principled statement, or like going back to his union and saying we need to have like new rules, or like instating a new law that would like punish passengers who wound flight attendants. I mean, those are all like perfectly reasonable activist things to do, but they confirm the existing state of things. I'm going to read just a tiny bit above where Lionel read. Wait, 137. Judgment confirms what exists. Okay, here we go. The bottom of page 137, and then we'll get back to what Lionel read, which will help us to think about the difference between two kinds of powers of thought. Okay. Here. Do you want me to project it again? Why not? Why not? Let's look at those dancing words. Talking about Orson Welles. The truthful man in the end wants nothing other than to judge life. He holds up a superior value, the good, in the name of which he will be able to judge. He is craving to judge. He sees in life an evil, a fault which is to be atoned for. And this is the moral origin of the notion of truth. This is Nietzsche. This makes very good sense. Think about what kind of conditions people demand truthfulness. Conditions of outrage. Conditions of anger, of resentment in particular, of outrage that somebody else is not playing by the rules or having a better time than you. The truthful man, in the end, wants nothing other than to judge life and to say whether an event is living up to some kind of moral expectations. And this is this is judging life instead of seeing life as an outpouring, as a becoming, as the unforeseen, as conditions for new things happening all the time. Judgment, the truthful man wants to judge. In the Nietzschean fashion, Wells has constantly battled against the system of judgment. There is no value superior to life. Life is not to be judged or justified. It is innocent. It has the innocence of becoming, beyond good and evil. And here, in the cinema books, he's brushing against philosophies that he's dealt with in more detail in other places. Nevertheless, he is bringing these concepts from Nietzsche to try to talk about something, about an ethics, really, about what cinema has to do with an ethics of life. So let's go back to what Lionel read. Just a bit above what Lionel is reading, we have this. Affect as immanent evaluation instead of judgment as transcendent value. Now this resonates with us, obviously. I love or I hate instead of I judge. And it's interesting to think of an affective response as a relinquishment of judgment. And it could be, and it usually is the case, that an affect will conclude in a judgment. But it need not be.
Right. If it's not conditioned, if it's just what comes prior to reflection, therefore it comes prior to judgment, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So the flight attendant, he responded. His affect prompted him to do this new thing. He didn't stay to judge. He didn't, stay to judge this woman, or even to judge like the conditions of his job. I'm suggesting. He followed the line of flight proposed by this affective response. Okay, so let's go back to this idea. So what Lionel read was two kinds of becoming, two kinds of power of the false. The power of the false is that it isn't trying to affirm the truth. One of them is this exhaustion. This is what you're talking about, Bree. There's will to power on both sides, but the latter, there's good and bad, noble and base. Among physicists say that noble energy is the kind which is capable of transforming itself, while the base kind can no longer do so. There's will to power on both sides, as you said, but the latter, the base kind of energy, is nothing more than will to dominate in the exhausted becoming of life. While the former is artistic will, or virtue which gives the creation of new possibilities and outpouring becoming. The good has only one name, it is generosity. If becoming is the power of the false, and the good, the generous, the noble is what? Oops. It's what? Raises the false to the nth power, or the will to power to the level of artistic becoming. This makes some sense. And a little bit further on, he says, exhausted life is better than no life at all. It's still better. Being sick with life is better than judging life. But it's more of a becoming. If you are exhausted, at least you're not like putting up with the status quo. But still, if you have the energy to do it, then the power of the false as artistic becoming is what would really create the conditions for the new.
It's false because it's not recognized. It's not the usual truth with a capital T.
Yes, it falsifies the usual scheme of things. It multiplies possibilities. So, I'm almost sorry now that we spent so long on this, because I brought it up specifically to go with Ryan's movie. Okay, so now my ambition is to go back to the genealogy of Islamic thought, traveling to Europe, talking about one particular figure, Ibn Al-Hazan. I'm going to do that super fast, and then show some pictures that would represent the kind of subjective and embodied vision that he described. Okay? So, thumbs up. All right. I've already mentioned Al-Hazan to you. His full name is Abu Ali Al-Hazan ibn Al-Haytham, born in Basra in 965, died in Cairo in 1039.
Basra, Cairo. He was born in Iraq and he moved to Cairo to work for the Fatimid Caliph. Known in the West as Al-Hazan.
Oh, I've got pictures. I have a picture. Ibn al-Haytham. And here is a diagram based on, he did those.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, isn't that
That's
amazing?
the optic nerve, eh?
Yeah, he did experimental optics. He did dissection. He figured out quite a lot about the physiology of perception, and he's also a theorist.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, okay. So this is the Kitab al-Manazir, the treatise on optics from 1083. So that's what I'm going to unplug this now and read to you a little bit from the lecture. All right. And this is a lecture about a history of embodied perception. Now, Ibn al-Haytham worked with optics, theories of optics from the Greeks. But the dominant theory of vision that he inherited from Greek optics was the extromission theory of vision, the idea that the eyes send out rays and kind of light up what they look at. Ibn al-Haytham confirmed the intromission theory of vision. Super important. And he did he developed a very complex physiology and psychology of visual sensation. Now, Ibn al-Haytham made one mistake, which would not be corrected until Kepler in the 17th century. This mistake was that he didn't account for the role of the lens in focusing all these light rays that come into the eye. So Ibn al-Haytham understood vision to be this enormous, overwhelming of material that comes into the eye, and he said, okay, the perception must be an act of comparing and judging all of these sensations. He came up with a theory of perception that is time-based, because you receive a sensation, you compare it with other sensations. That is deductive, meaning you get all this stuff in at once and you have to deduce what you are seeing. And subjective, because you have to subjectively compare these combinations of sensations. And he had a list of 22 visible properties that he figured the brain had to compare, things like brightness, the impression of solidity, color, all these things. So he assumed that the act of perception would involve a great deal of subjective judgment. And he also theorized that there are two kinds of looks, one that is merely glancing and one that's contemplative, that involves all of this kind of comparison and weighing. So therefore, according to Ibn al-Haytham, merely to recognize a form requires drawing on memory and comparing what you have received now with what you have seen in the past. And this is carried out in what he called the faculty of judgment. So form, whether something is square or round, is a psychological concept. Now, this is where we're going to get into some art. I won't keep interrupting this. I'll show you the art in a sec. So this model of vision as subjective and embodied and entailing judgments carried out in time was very appropriate for the art of his time. several art historians have mentioned this, because as you'll see in a moment, this was an art in Fatimid Cairo where he was working, that was, and also in Iraq where he came from, that was abstract, entailed multiple points, visual points of entry, and invited a very subjective kind of perception. We'll think about that when we look at the pictures. Okay, so this Ibn al-Haytham's optics was received with great hunger in the West in the late medieval period, when, as I mentioned to you yesterday, the people of what was becoming Europe started to realize that they needed science. And so his optics was translated just over 100 years after he wrote it. It was translated, actually, no, less than 100 years after he wrote it. It was translated into Latin by Gerard of Cremona, who was working in this translation center in Toledo, Spain. And Gerard of Cremona died in 1187. So this translation of Ibn al-Haytham's optics was before. So you get a sense of the speed of transmission of ideas from science from the Arab world, which at that time was the world's center of scientific and also philosophical activity, to the not yet Renaissance Europe. Okay, so his theory of optics was influential among both scientists and philosophers. It influenced the 13th century scholastic philosophers, Grosseteste, Roger Bacon, who developed their own theories of vision. Vitellot, who began to develop a theory of perspective, which influenced Kepler, and some other people, including Thomas, Archbishop of York. So it's interesting to think how Ibn al-Haytham's theory of subjective perception becomes indigenized in medieval Europe, and informs a way of thinking about perception as a kind of private matter, and the idea that the visual is something that everybody can objectively agree on. For example, this is not an idea that comes until later. Okay, so as I said, Ibn al-Haytham's optics was the dominant theory until the 17th century, when Kepler corrected his error about the role of the lens. Okay, so you all know about Renaissance perspective, and people usually discuss the rise of perspective in paintings, the idea of a single point perspective that ensures the sovereignty and objectivity of the viewer. Foucault, among others, associates this new theory of vision with a new theory of the subject, a subject who is separate from what he surveys, and is capable of an objective and even totalizing kind of vision. And a disembodied, this is very important, a disembodied perception. So Renaissance perspective and the new kind of theory of visuality it entailed is one of vision that is distant, disembodied, and objective. So this carries on, leads to great, a lot of people have theorized all kinds of consequences of Renaissance perspective, as far as imperialism, the idea of being sovereign and separate from what one surveys. I'm not going to. Okay, what is interesting to me is experiments in the 19th century, experiments in optics that began to suggest that vision actually is embodied and subjective. And this is beautifully described in another book by Jonathan Crary, which, because I only slept for 4 hours last night, I can't. Oh yes, Techniques of the Observer. Techniques of the Observer by Jonathan Crary describes these experiments in the early 19th century of people like Goethe, Purkinje, who would do experiments like looking at the sun, then closing their eyes, seeing what they saw on the inside of their eyelids, drawing these, publishing them, saying, "Hey everybody, look what I see." You know, there are drawings of little white blood cells floating inside their eyes, drawings of veins, drawings of hallucinations that result from looking at the sun. These and many other experiments started to inform the idea that vision is embodied. And as we all know, we have difference in the physiology of our own vision. These began to inform new theories of perception, of which the most salient spokesperson is Henri Bergson in his Matter and Memory of 1896, who returns to a new model of perception as being subjective, taking place in the body, and taking place in time, which echoes in so many ways the writings of Ibn Al-Hazan. So it's a very interesting cycle of theories of visuality. Okay? Any questions or comments? All right. Now I want to talk, I'm going to show some pictures very soon. I'm going to talk about abstract mind and haptic space. For now, I'll just suggest that they are two forms that are visible forms that are independent of figuration. So I would say that the abstract line and haptic space are ways for the visible to unfold without producing a figurative image. So the abstract, I'm not going to read the quote, I'm going to go straight to the slideshow. We'll go back to the article tomorrow. But they write about how abstract line is a line that is no longer delineating the contour of a form, and instead is free to go off and be itself. And similarly, haptic space is space that floats free of any form that might have contained it, and creates a kind of a smooth space for the eye. And in abstract line and haptic space, fixed form, especially depictions of figures, give way to perceptual metamorphosis, where figure and ground shift. And they are both abstract line and haptic space. Because they work against form, they're a kind of non-organic life, I argue, that they have a life of their own that multiplies in a general way, but they also menace life in particular because of the way they destroy, eat away at form. So I think I have the rest memorized enough that we can just go to the slideshow. Now, haptic, so now if I want to control that, is a term that the art historian Alois Riegel uses, haptisch, which means tactile,
It means grabbing. So Riegel came up with this distinction between haptic, or tactile, and optical. And Deleuze and Guattari talk about it in that section of on nomad art. So, so optical visuality is what we usually think of visuality as being. But this is fine, we can. That's fine.
Okay.
So optical visuality is a visuality where one's object of vision is clear and separate and distant, where figure is clearly delineated from ground, and it's relatively disembodied. Haptic visuality is a visuality that's like touching with the eyes. It entails closeness. In fact, even being so close to the thing you're looking at that you can't tell what it is. Yeah.
What about like stereograms?
I don't know.
You know stereograms, you put it really close to your face and you don't understand what's there. At
Because
first.
they're two pictures?
It's not clear what's there, but
Mhm.
after a while you see an image in 3D. It's quite amazing.
Oh. Yeah, but so it resolves into the optical.
It does.
Mm-hmm.
It does.
Well, we're going to look at some haptic pictures very, very soon.
So it's
But Paula, that is really... And the next.
Okay.
Okay, so one of the things that Alois Riegel talks about is how this vine motif from Greek and Roman art that you see here, it's abstracted. It's not a real vine, especially because it's an acanthus, which is a plant and not a vine. But it still is kind of naturalistic in the way it grows. So this gets taken up in Islamic art, and it becomes artificialized. Can you show the next slide, please, Paula?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a very, very late iteration. But what happens in Islamic art is that vine from Greek and Roman art, and also like Sassanid Persian art, gets denaturalized. And where it used to, like a normal vine, it goes along, makes a leaf, makes a tendril, and terminates, in a bud or something. In Islamic art, those buds, instead of being the end, they become a new beginning point. So, which is something that no real plant would ever do, right? A plant does not grow out of a bud. And this is a pretty okay example of that occurring, and a late example of Iranian ornament. It's like actually got two vine systems overlaid. So you see how once Islamic art freed the plant motif from having to look like a plant and allowed it to sprout a new plant at any point, whatever, it could cover the surface in an infinite way.